In the quiet, remote town of Hollow Creek, nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, legends are as old as the trees that surround it. The locals whisper of forgotten places, shadowy hollers where the light of day seldom reaches, and where things best left undisturbed reside. It's a place where the past lingers in the mist, and the line between the living and the unknown is easily blurred. For Mary and her two younger sisters, Sarah and Emily, the old stories were just that, stories. The kind meant to keep children close to home and out of the woods after dark. But on one crisp autumn day, the three sisters decide to venture beyond the familiar trails of their town and into the heart of an old mountain holler, a place shrouded in mystery and fear. What begins as a simple adventure quickly spirals into a terrifying ordeal as they realize they are not alone. Something is following them, something ancient and powerful, with wings that beat against the air like the drums of war. As the shadows grow longer and the night closes in, the sisters find themselves in a desperate race for their lives, pursued by a monstrous creature that seems to emerge from the very fabric of their worst nightmares. But even as they flee, questions gnaw at their minds. What is this creature? Why is it hunting them? And most importantly, will they make it out of the holler alive? Prepare to enter a world where the woods have eyes, the shadows hide dark secrets, and courage is tested against the unknown. This is the story of the Wings of the Holler, a tale of survival, fear, and the haunting realization that some places are better left unexplored. The town of Hollow Creek was the kind of place that time forgot. Nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, it was a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew each other's business. The houses, weathered by decades of harsh winters and humid summers, lined the single dirt road that wound its way through the center of town. Tall, ancient trees surrounded the town, their branches forming a protective canopy that seemed to shield Hollow Creek from the outside world. It was a place where stories were passed down through generations, and where old superstitions were taken as seriously as the morning news. Mary, the eldest of the three sisters, was a curious and adventurous soul. At 18, she was already considered an adult by the town standards, but her spirit was far from settled. Her younger sisters, Sarah and Emily, often followed her on her explorations, eager to see what new wonders Mary would lead them to. The three of them were inseparable. Bound by more than just blood, they shared a sense of wonder for the world around them, a thirst for adventure that the quiet town of Hollow Creek could rarely satisfy. On this particular autumn day, the air was crisp and cool, the sky a brilliant blue with only a few wisps of clouds. The sisters had spent the morning helping their mother with chores, but by midday they were itching to get out of the house. Mary suggested they go for a walk to one of their usual spots, a peaceful clearing near the edge of the woods where they often spent their afternoons. Their mother, knowing the spot well, gave her usual warnings.
"Don't stray too far, girls, and be back before dark."
Mary smiled and reassured her mother.
"Don't worry, we'll just go to the clearing. We'll be back before you know it."
But as the sisters packed a small bag with snacks and a canteen of water, their true plan was clear to each other. They were going to explore a place they had only heard about in hushed tones, the Holler. The Holler had always been a place of fascination for Mary. She had heard the stories, tales of strange sounds and shadows that moved without light. The Holler was a narrow valley on the far side of the mountain, a place that the locals avoided, claiming it was best left undisturbed. But those were just stories, Mary told herself. The woods were full of legends, and most of them were just that, legends. The sisters set off in the early afternoon, the sun still high in the sky. As they walked through the familiar woods, the trees rustled gently in the breeze, their leaves a kaleidoscope of reds, oranges, and yellows. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, the occasional rustle of a deer or rabbit in the underbrush. Mary led the way, her eyes sharp and focused, while Sarah and Emily chatted animatedly behind her, their voices mingling with the sounds of the forest. But as they reached the fork in the path, Mary took a right instead of the usual left, leading them away from the familiar clearing and deeper into the unknown. Sarah and Emily hesitated for a moment, exchanging glances.
Are you sure about this, Mary?
Sarah asked, her voice tinged with excitement and a hint of fear.
We've been to the clearing 100 times,
Mary replied with a grin.
but we've never been here. Don't you want to see what's out there? Think of the stories we could tell when we get back.
The path to the holler was narrow and overgrown, barely visible among the thick underbrush. As they followed it, the trees began to grow taller and denser, their branches forming a tangled web overhead that blocked out the sunlight. The air grew cooler, the light dimmer, and the sounds of the forest seemed to fade away, replaced by an eerie silence. The sisters slowed their pace, their earlier excitement giving way to a sense of unease. As they reached the edge of the holler, they paused, looking down into the narrow valley below. The holler was a dark, narrow cleft in the mountains, its steep walls covered in moss and vines. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches twisted into strange, unnatural shapes. A thin mist clung to the ground, swirling around the base of the trees like something alive. The air was still heavy, with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Mary took a deep breath, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement.
This is it. This is the entrance.
She whispered, as if speaking too loudly would disturb the silence. Sarah and Emily stood close behind her, their eyes wide with wonder and trepidation. The three sisters stood at the entrance to the holler, unaware that they were about to embark on a journey that would change their lives forever. The three sisters stood at the edge of the holler, peering into the narrow valley that stretched out before them. The atmosphere was unlike anything they had experienced before. The air was thick with a damp chill that clung to their skin, and the silence was almost oppressive, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The holler seemed to swallow the light, casting long, eerie shadows that danced on the ground with the slightest movement of the trees. Mary, always the boldest, took the first step into the holler. The ground beneath her feet was soft and uneven, covered in a thick layer of decaying leaves and moss. She glanced back at her sisters, offering a reassuring smile.
Come on, it's just a little further. We've come this far, haven't we?
Sarah and Emily exchanged nervous glances, but followed their sister, stepping carefully over the twisted roots that snaked across the path. The deeper they ventured into the holler, the more the world outside seemed to fade away. The trees grew taller and more twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal arms, and the mist thickened, swirling around their ankles as they walked. As they continued, the light filtering through the canopy above grew dimmer, casting the holler in a perpetual twilight. The once familiar sounds of the forest were replaced by an eerie stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an unseen bird. The silence was unsettling, as if the forest itself was watching them, waiting for something. Mary tried to keep her focus on the path ahead, but her mind was racing. The stories she had heard about the holler suddenly seemed more real, more threatening. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the edge of the trees, hidden in the shadows.
Do you think we should turn back?
Emily's voice was barely above a whisper, her usual bravado replaced by a quiet fear. She clutched Mary's arm, her eyes wide as she scanned the trees for any sign of movement.
Not yet.
Mary replied, though her voice lacked its usual confidence.
We're fine. It's just the trees and the mist. It's playing tricks on us.
She wasn't sure if she was trying to convince her sisters or herself, but she pushed forward, determined to see what lay deeper within the holler. As they rounded a bend in the path, the holler opened up slightly, revealing a small clearing where the trees parted just enough to allow a faint sliver of light to pierce through the canopy. The sisters paused, taking in the sight. The clearing was strangely beautiful, yet there was something unsettling about it, something that felt wrong. In the center of the clearing stood an ancient, gnarled tree, its roots twisting and burrowing deep into the earth. The tree's bark was blackened and cracked, as if it had been struck by lightning long ago, Yet it still stood tall and proud, its twisted branches reaching high into the air. The mist seemed to cling to the tree, wrapping around its base like a shroud. Mary approached the tree cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the soft ground. She reached out to touch the bark, her fingers brushing against its rough surface. As she did, a strange feeling washed over her, a sense of foreboding, as if she had disturbed something that was better left undisturbed. She quickly withdrew her hand, stepping back to rejoin her sisters.
Let's keep moving.
Mary said, her voice tight. The sense of unease that had been building since they entered the holler was growing stronger, and she didn't want to linger any longer than necessary. As they turned to leave the clearing, the first sound they had heard in what felt like hours broke the silence, the faint, rhythmic beating of wings. It was distant at first, barely audible over the sound of their own breathing, but it grew louder with each passing moment. The sisters froze, their hearts pounding in their chests as they strained to locate the source of the sound.
What is that?
Sarah whispered, her eyes darting around the clearing, searching for any sign of movement.
I don't know,
Mary replied, her voice barely more than a breath.
but we need to keep moving, now.
With a shared look of fear, the sisters hurried out of the clearing, the sound of the beating wings growing louder behind them. They didn't know what was following them, but they could feel its presence, something big, something that didn't belong in the world they knew. As they pressed on, the shadows deepened, and the path ahead seemed to twist and turn in ways that defied logic. The only thing they knew for certain was that they needed to get out of the holler, and fast. The sisters moved quickly through the holler, their footsteps hurried and uneven as the eerie sound of beating wings grew louder behind them. The once clear path now seemed to twist and turn in unpredictable ways, the shadows of the trees elongating unnaturally as the light continued to fade. Mary, leading the way, kept her eyes on the ground, scanning for any sign of a familiar landmark. But the landscape had changed. Everything felt different, darker, and more menacing. As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and a thick fog began to settle in around them, further obscuring their vision. The mist swirled around their feet like ghostly tendrils, and every step felt heavier, as if the very earth was trying to pull them down. The trees on either side seemed to close in, their branches arching overhead to form a dark, oppressive canopy.
Mary, where are we?
Sarah's voice trembled, her usual confidence shaken by the oppressive atmosphere. She clutched Emily's hand tightly, both sisters glancing nervously at the darkening sky.
I'm not sure.
Mary admitted, her voice strained with worry. She didn't want to show fear, but the truth was, she was just as frightened as her sisters. The path they had been following seemed to have disappeared, replaced by a tangled mess of roots and rocks that threatened to trip them with every step. Just then, a dark shadow passed overhead, momentarily blocking out the moonlight. The sisters froze, their breath catching in their throats. The shadow was massive, far larger than any bird they had ever seen. It moved swiftly, gliding silently through the mist before disappearing into the darkness.
What was that?
Emily whispered, her voice barely audible.
I don't know.
Mary replied, her eyes scanning the sky for any sign of movement.
But whatever it is, it's big.
As they stood there, trying to make sense of what they had just seen, the beating of wings resumed, louder this time, and closer. The sound was unmistakable, the rhythmic flapping filling the air with a sense of dread. The sisters huddled together, their eyes wide with fear, as the shadow passed over them again, this time lingering for just a moment before vanishing into the trees. Mary's heart pounded in her chest, and she felt a cold sweat break out on her forehead. Whatever was following them, it was watching them, tracking their every move. The realization sent a chill down her spine, and she knew they had to keep moving. Standing still was not an option.
Come on.
Mary urged, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her forward.
We have to keep going. We can't stay here.
The sisters stumbled forward, their pace quickening as the sound of wings seemed to circle around them, echoing off the trees in a disorienting way. Every few moments, the shadow would pass over them again, blotting out the faint light that still filtered through the trees. It was as if the creature was playing with them, herding them deeper into the holler. The forest itself seemed to conspire against them. The mist thickened, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead, and the ground grew more treacherous with every step. The roots twisted up from the earth like gnarled fingers, grabbing at their ankles, while the rocks jutted out at odd angles, threatening to trip them. Panic began to set in, and their movements became more frantic. Emily tripped over a root and nearly fell, but Sarah caught her just in time, pulling her upright as they continued to run. The beating of wings was now almost constant, a terrifying reminder that they were not alone. Then, out of the corner of her eye, Mary saw it, the shadowy form of the creature swooping low over the trees. It was massive, its wingspan wider than the path itself, and its movement was swift and purposeful. For a brief moment, the creature was illuminated by a flash of moonlight, and Mary caught a glimpse of its dark feathered body and sharp, curved beak. It was like nothing she had ever seen, a monstrous bird-like creature that seemed to belong to another world.
Run!
Mary shouted, her voice breaking through the paralyzing fear that had gripped them all. Without another word, the sisters broke into a sprint, their feet pounding against the earth as they fled from the creature that stalked them. The forest flew by in a blur, the trees and mist melding into a single, terrifying landscape as they ran for their lives. The creature gave chase, its screech echoing through the holler like a banshee's wail. The sound was enough to drive them forward, faster than they had ever run before. They didn't know where they were going, only that they had to get away to escape the relentless pursuit of the beast that hunted them. As they raced through the forest, the path began to narrow, and the trees grew closer together, their branches forming a dark tunnel that seemed to close in around them. The beating of wings was deafening now, the creature closing in on them with terrifying speed. But just as the sisters thought they could run no more, the path suddenly widened, revealing a clearing ahead. The moonlight poured into the space, casting long shadows across the ground. With a final burst of energy, they dashed into the clearing, the creature's screech echoing behind them. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature veered off, its massive wings carrying it back into the darkness of the holler. The sisters stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, their hearts racing. They turned back to look at the path they had just fled, but the creature was gone, swallowed by the shadows. The clearing was silent. The only sound was the ragged breathing of the sisters as they tried to comprehend what had just happened. The holler, with its ancient trees and thick mist, loomed behind them, a place of terror and mystery that they knew they would never forget. The sisters stood in the clearing, their breath coming in ragged gasps as they tried to steady themselves. The night air was cold, and the silence that had returned after the creature's departure was almost suffocating. They huddled together, their eyes darting around the perimeter of the clearing, half expecting the monstrous bird to swoop down on them at any moment. Mary was the first to speak, her voice shaky but determined.
We need to keep moving. We can't stay out in the open like this.
Sarah and Emily nodded, still too shaken to respond. They knew Mary was right. Staying in one place would only make them easier prey if the creature decided to return. With trembling hands, Mary took hold of Sarah's arm, leading her back toward the edge of the clearing. Emily followed closely, her eyes never leaving the dark shadows that surrounded them. But before they could take more than a few steps, the silence was shattered by a sudden, deafening screech. The sound echoed through the forest, reverberating off the trees and sending a jolt of fear through the sisters. They froze in place, their hearts pounding in their chests, as the screech was followed by the unmistakable sound of beating wings, this time much closer than before. The creature was coming back.
Run!
Mary shouted, her voice breaking through the paralysis that had gripped them. The sisters bolted toward the tree line, desperate to find cover before the creature could reach them. But they had only taken a few steps when a massive shadow descended over the clearing, blocking out the moonlight and plunging them into darkness. The creature landed in the clearing with a thunderous crash, its enormous wings sending gusts of wind that whipped through the trees. The sisters skidded to a halt, their eyes wide with terror as they finally came face to face with the monstrous bird-like creature that had been stalking them. It was unlike anything they had ever seen, a nightmarish amalgamation of bird and beast, with dark, ragged feathers that seemed to absorb the light. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural, malevolent light, and its sharp, curved beak looked capable of tearing through anything that crossed its path. The creature's wings were massive, stretching out on either side of its body like a living shadow, and its talons dug deep into the earth as it crouched, ready to strike. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The sisters were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak as they stared into the creature's glowing eyes. The creature let out another ear-piercing screech, its beak snapping open and shut with a bone-chilling sound that echoed through the clearing. Mary, summoning every ounce of courage she had left, grabbed her sister's hands and pulled them back, trying to put as much distance between them and the creature as possible. But the creature was faster. With a single, powerful leap, it launched itself into the air, its wings beating furiously as it took flight, circling above them like a predator sizing up its prey. The sisters ran, their feet pounding against the earth as they fled deeper into the forest. The creature followed, its massive wings casting long shadows over the trees as it swooped down toward them. The sound of its screeches filled the air, growing louder and more frenzied with each passing moment. Emily stumbled over a root, crying out as she fell to the ground. Mary and Sarah skidded to a halt, turning back to help her up. But before they could reach her, the creature swooped down, its talons outstretched, ready to snatch her up.
Emily, move!
Mary screamed, her heart leaping into her throat as she watched the creature descend. Emily scrambled to her feet just in time, diving out of the way as the creature's talons sliced through the air where she had been moments before. The creature let out a frustrated screech, banking hard to make another pass. The sisters ran faster, their legs burning with the effort, their lungs straining for breath. The forest seemed to close in around them, the trees a blur of dark shapes as they tore through the underbrush. The creature was relentless, its wings beating like the drums of war as it pursued them, determined not to let them escape. Finally, the trees began to thin, and the sisters saw the glimmer of moonlight filtering through the branches ahead. The edge of the holler was close if they could just make it out. Maybe, just maybe, they could escape the creature's wrath. With a final burst of energy, they sprinted toward the light, their hearts pounding with fear and desperation. The creature was right behind them, its screeches echoing through the forest like the cries of a banshee. As they burst out of the trees and into the open, the creature let out a final, ear-splitting screech. But instead of following them out of the holler, it abruptly veered off, its massive wings carrying it back into the darkness of the forest. The sisters stumbled to a halt, gasping for breath, their hearts still racing as they watched the creature disappear into the shadows. The forest was silent once more, the only sound the rustling of leaves in the wind. The sisters looked at each other, their faces pale and drawn with fear. They had escaped the creature's clutches, but the terror of the encounter lingered, a cold knot of fear lodged in their chests. They had survived, but the memory of the creature's glowing eyes and bone-chilling screeches would haunt them forever. The sisters stood at the edge of the holler, gasping for breath as they watched the creature disappear into the darkness. The once terrifying screeches of the bird-like beast faded into the distance, replaced by the soft rustling of leaves and the gentle hum of the night. For a moment, they were frozen, unable to believe they had truly escaped its grasp. The moonlight bathed the clearing in a soft, pale glow, casting long shadows across the ground. The forest beyond the holler was silent, as if it too was recovering from the terror that had just unfolded. The air was cool, and the faint scent of earth and moss filled their lungs as they tried to calm their racing hearts. Mary was the first to break the silence, her voice trembling but steady.
We need to go home.
She said, her eyes fixed on the path that led away from the holler.
We can't stay here.
Sarah and Emily nodded, still too shaken to speak. Their legs felt like lead, their bodies bruised and battered from the frantic escape, but they knew they had to keep moving. The creature had retreated, but the memory of its glowing eyes and the sound of its wings still haunted them. With slow, deliberate steps, the sisters began to make their way out of the clearing. The path ahead was unfamiliar, but anything was better than staying in the holler. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the trees for any sign of the creature's return, their ears straining to catch even the faintest sound of wings. As they walked, the forest began to change. The trees grew less dense, the underbrush less tangled. The oppressive darkness that had filled the holler started to lift, replaced by a softer, more natural night. The moonlight grew brighter, illuminating the path before them. The mist that had clung to the ground in the holler dissipated, revealing the familiar contours of the forest they knew. Despite the relief of being out of the holler, the sisters remained tense, their senses heightened by the fear of the unknown. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of adrenaline through their bodies. But as they continued to walk, the forest remained quiet, as if the creature had truly retreated to its dark domain. After what felt like hours, the sisters finally emerged from the trees onto a familiar trail, the path that led back to Hollow Creek. The sight of the trail brought a wave of relief, and for the first time since entering the holler, they felt a glimmer of hope. They were almost home.
We made it.
Emily whispered, her voice filled with a mixture of disbelief and relief. Sarah placed a comforting hand on her shoulder.
We did?
She said softly.
But what was that thing, Mary? What did we see?
Mary shook her head, her expression troubled.
I don't know.
She admitted.
But whatever it was, it doesn't belong in our world.
The sisters continued down the trail, their pace quickening as the familiar sights of the forest surrounded them. The fear that had gripped them in the holler began to fade, replaced by a deep exhaustion that settled into their bones. They had survived, but the experience had left them shaken to their core. As they neared the outskirts of Hollow Creek, the lights of the town came into view, twinkling through the trees like distant stars. The sight of home brought a sense of safety, but also a sense of unease. The sisters knew that what they had encountered in the holler was far beyond anything they had ever imagined, and the memory of the creature's glowing eyes would haunt them for a long time to come. When they finally reached their house, the sisters paused at the edge of the yard, looking back at the dark forest they had just escaped. The night was quiet, and the house stood as it always had, a comforting presence in the dark. But the sisters knew that something had changed. Something in the holler had awakened, and it was watching them. Without a word, they entered the house, closing the door firmly behind them. The safety of the indoors felt like a fragile barrier against the terror they had just faced. As they settled into the familiar warmth of their home, the reality of what they had experienced began to sink in. They didn't speak of the creature that night, but the unspoken understanding between them was clear. They would never venture into the holler again. Whatever secrets it held were better left undisturbed, buried in the darkness where they belonged. As the sisters lay in their beds, the events of the night replayed in their minds. The beating of wings, the screech of the creature, the feeling of being hunted. It was a nightmare they couldn't escape, even in the safety of their home. And though they had escaped the holler, they knew that the fear would follow them, a shadow in the back of their minds. The night passed slowly, and when the first light of dawn broke through the windows, the sisters were still awake, their eyes heavy with exhaustion, but their minds alert. They had survived, but the question lingered. What else lay hidden in the shadows of Hollow Creek, waiting to be discovered? The days following their harrowing escape from the holler were marked by an unsettling quiet in Hollow Creek. The sisters had returned to their routines, but there was a tension in the air, a sense that something was not quite right. The townspeople went about their business, blissfully unaware of the terror the sisters had faced in the dark woods. But for Mary, Sarah, and Emily, the memory of that night lingered, casting long shadows over their thoughts. They spoke little of what had happened, each sister keeping the details of their fear to herself. Yet the bond between them grew stronger, forged in the fire of shared terror. They had survived something unimaginable, and though they had made it back, they were not the same. As the autumn days grew shorter and the nights colder, the sisters found themselves drawn together in the evenings, seeking comfort in each other's company. The nights were the hardest, the quiet moments when the world outside seemed to pause, and the memories of the holler came creeping back. The sound of wings, the piercing screech, the creature's glowing eyes, these haunted their dreams, leaving them restless and uneasy. One night, as the first snow of winter began to fall, the sisters gathered by the fire, the warm glow casting flickering shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, but the warmth of the hearth offered a temporary reprieve from the cold and the memories that gnawed at them.
I keep thinking about that creature.
Sarah said, breaking the silence. Her voice was soft, but it carried the weight of the fear she had been holding back.
Why did it turn back? We were right there. It could have it almost.
Mary, who had been staring into the flames, looked up.
I've been thinking about that too.
She admitted.
It was like something stopped it. But what could make a creature like that turn away?
Emily shivered, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders.
Maybe it was protecting something. The holler, it felt like it was alive, like it didn't want us there.
The sisters fell silent, the crackling of the fire filling the space between them. The thought that something even more powerful could be lurking in the holler was a chilling one, but none of them could deny the truth of it. The holler had a presence, a force that had driven them away, and the creature was just a part of it.
I don't want to think about it anymore.
Sarah said, her voice trembling.
We're safe now. We made it out.
But even as she spoke the words, there was a part of her that knew they weren't entirely true. The holler might have let them go, but it had left its mark on them, a scar that would never fully heal. As the fire burned low, Mary stood and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The snow was falling steadily now, blanketing the ground in white. The forest beyond was a shadowy mass, the trees swaying in the wind like dark sentinels. She pressed her hand to the cold glass, her breath fogging up the window as she stared out into the night. And then she saw it, a shadow moving through the trees, just at the edge of the forest. It was fleeting, barely more than a flicker of movement, but it was there. Her heart skipped a beat, and she squinted, trying to make out the shape. But the shadow was gone, swallowed by the darkness.
Mary?
Emily's voice called softly from behind her.
What is it?
Mary hesitated for a moment before turning back to her sisters, a forced smile on her lips.
Nothing?
She said, though her voice was tight.
Just the wind in the trees.
But as she sat back down by the fire, a deep unease settled in her chest. The shadow had been real. She was sure of it. And though she didn't want to frighten her sisters, she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still being watched, that whatever lurked in the holler had followed them home. The fire crackled, and the sisters fell into a tense silence, each lost in her own thoughts. The wind outside howled louder, rattling the windows, but inside the house it was eerily still. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the hours passing in slow, agonizing silence. Finally, when the fire had burned down to glowing embers, the sisters retired to their beds, though none of them expected to sleep. Mary lay awake, her eyes wide in the darkness, the memory of the shadow still fresh in her mind. She listened to the wind, to the creaks and groans of the old house, every sound amplifying her fear. And just as she was about to drift off, she heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of wings beating against the air, growing louder and closer. Her heart raced as she sat up in bed, straining to hear, but the sound faded as quickly as it had come. The night was silent once more, but Mary knew that the peace was fragile, that something was still out there, waiting. The creature might have returned to the holler, but the sense of being watched, of something lurking in the shadows, remained. In the morning, the first light of dawn broke through the snow-covered trees, casting a pale glow over the town of Hollow Creek. The sisters awoke, Weary and unsettled, but determined to push the memories of the Holler aside, life had to go on, and they had to be strong for themselves and for each other. But even as they went about their day, there was a part of them that knew the Holler had not let them go completely. The shadow that had followed them, the sense of being watched, it was all too real, and it would never fully leave them. As the sun rose higher in the sky, the sisters resolved never to speak of the Holler again. But the memory of that night, the fear that had gripped them, and the shadow that lingered in the corners of their minds would stay with them, a silent reminder of the terror they had faced and the unknown that still lurked in the darkness. And though they would never return to the Holler, they knew that some things could never be escaped, that the shadows of the past had a way of following you, no matter how far you ran. Thank you for joining us on this chilling journey through the shadows of Hollow Creek and the depths of the old mountain Holler. The sisters may have escaped the clutches of the unknown, but the fear and mystery of that dark place will linger in their minds and in ours long after the story has ended. If you enjoyed this tale of suspense, terror, and the supernatural, be sure to like, share, and subscribe to WispHollow Tales for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss another journey into the eerie and unexplained. Remember, the woods are deep, the night is long, and some secrets are better left hidden. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, and be careful where you wander. The next story may be closer than you think. Three sisters venture into a remote mountain Holler, drawn by curiosity despite the ominous warnings. As they wander deeper into the dark woods, they begin to feel the presence of something sinister. The beating of massive wings echoes through the trees, and they catch glimpses of a shadowy creature blocking out the moonlight. When the sisters finally come face to face with the monstrous bird-like entity, they must flee for their lives, but the Holler isn't done with them yet.